Iran retaliates. Is that it? I'm Scott Ott, and this is Bill Whittle now. And Bill, overnight as we record this, the Islamic Republic of Iran took an act of retaliation over the killing of Quds Force leader Qassem Soleimani by firing, last count I heard, was some 22 missiles toward U.S. bases in Iraq. And two of those missiles were apparently duds, but the other 20 hit. Iran is telling its domestic audience that there were heavy casualties. However, the U.S. Pentagon is saying that there were zero casualties, and Iraq seems to indicate the same, that they suffered no casualties among their people as well. Iran is also sending a message saying, basically, that's all, folks. We think this was a proportional response to the killing of Soleimani, and we don't intend further escalation unless the president of the United States does, in which case they said that they would exact a massive, greater response or implement a greater response than they did this time around. Bill, all of this, realizing that the breaking news can change everything by the time we even post this video.
Of course.
If President Trump does not further respond and basically says, look, no harm, no foul, you didn't kill anybody. Apparently, there may not have even been any substantial damage to U.S. or Iraqi facilities. So that's it. We're done with this little round. Does that not keep the status quo in place with Iran as a state sponsor of terror, and they're just shuffling the deck at the top?
No, on the contrary. If you look at the actual score, let's just say that I have not seen any reason, certainly in the last 30 years, to doubt Pentagon numbers for our own losses. So I'm going to go with the Pentagon on this one rather than the Iranians. And so if you want to look at the scoreboard for the latest exchange, it's one terror leader, top mastermind, gone versus 20 smoking areas on a base versus no American or Iraqi losses.
In addition to an Iraqi militia leader who was part of that Soleimani strike.
Sweet. So here's the one thing I think that bears just constant, just keeping this in your mind the whole time. And this is something I learned relatively recently. During the Cold War, the United States was flying U-2 flights over the Soviet Union just prior to a major summit between Eisenhower and Khrushchev in 1960 in Paris, and Eisenhower and Khrushchev had started to form a bit of a relationship. Eisenhower flew the U-2 flights over the Soviet Union. On the last flight, the last one he wanted to allow, Francis Gary Powers got shot down, created a international incident. Stay with me on this. Khrushchev was upset about this, needless to say, but he had known that those flights were going on over the Soviet Union the whole time, and he didn't want to announce them because it made the Soviet Union look completely impotent to announce that American planes are flying over their most sensitive positions.
At will.
With impunity, right. Now, here's where it gets to be important. And Khrushchev was more or less ready to let the thing go, except Eisenhower felt compelled to do a press conference explaining what had happened, kind of furthering the cover story lie. And that's what enraged Khrushchev. And the reason it enraged Khrushchev was because it publicly embarrassed him. He'd been embarrassed privately, but he was now publicly embarrassed by this. And so when many years later, many of the same individuals, actually, who worked on the U-2 program, made an attempt to raise a Soviet submarine off the floor of the ocean, K-129, I want to say it was. But they basically had the greatest intelligence operation in history. They built a special ship, reached down 16,000 feet to the bottom of the ocean, grabbed onto the Soviet sub and pulled it to the surface. When that happened, President Ford had spoken with Kissinger about this, and both of them had read Khrushchev's memoirs about what had happened back in 1960 with the U-2. And both of them had realized that if we're going to publicly deny this, then that is international news. Stay with me, folks. And that embarrasses the Soviets, and that's what the Soviets can't handle is the international embarrassment. So they decided not to say a word about it. They basically came up with the we can neither confirm nor deny argument. So this is what this lesson taught me in the same way it taught Ford and Kissinger and presumably most presidents after that. When you're dealing with a tyrannical regime that deals with force to control its population, it can withstand anything other than humiliation. humiliation of the regime is what weakens the regime in the minds of the people that it is residing over, and that's the one thing that they can't tolerate.
So would it be a better approach for President Trump to?
Let me just finish.
Okay.
Sorry, I'm almost there. Almost connected all of these strange dots. So if it turns out that the Iranian response to this counterstrike, which started with their attack on our embassy, I might add, if it turns out that really is it, the president would be wise to not say anything about it, because if Iran is telling its people, hey, we killed hundreds of Americans in this missile strike, okay, the important thing for the Iranians, for the mullahs, is to remain in control of their own population. This is very difficult for us to understand. It's antithetical to the way we think in the West. But if the Iranian mullahs can convince their own people that this magnificent missile attack caused horrendous American casualties, the elimination of Soleimani was international news and an international humiliation to the Iranian regime. If the Iranian regime can convince the Iranian people that we have responded proportionally and put the Americans on their knees, then things kind of stabilize and we can look at the scoreboard. And it's 2 enemy generals killed versus a couple of smoking holes on an airplane someplace. So I think that would be the way I would play it if I was in the American position. I would just say, okay.
So that seems like a good approach. In fact, I heard a general, retired general on CNN last night talking about how he repeatedly used the phrase that everybody should take a breath. And that makes a lot of sense. Your approach makes a lot of sense when it comes to settling down the tensions and essentially saying, look, it was tit for tat, we're even, and that's it. However, it does 2 things, and that gets to the root of my original question, which is, number one, it essentially leaves the status quo vis-a-vis Iran and the United States unchanged. And secondly, it actually reinforces in the captive Iranian people's minds that their regime is powerful and that they cross it only at their own peril. Doesn't it make sense for us to more foster a sense of that the mullahs are weak rather than that they are strong?
Well, now you've put yourself in the kind of box that all presidents find themselves in, but which Donald Trump, given the hostility of the press towards him, is in specifically kind of almost historically unique set of narrow constraints. If Donald Trump were to do what you suggest, to keep up the pressure on the Iranian regime in order to show the Iranian people how weak the mullahs are, then he's going to be called a warmonger, an escalator, and all the rest of it. And so you find yourself as president of the United States, as they almost always do, and this point can't be stressed often enough. This is the way that we think about the world. We're just so simplistic about things. We think that the president has a good choice and a bad choice. And when he takes the bad choice, we go, what the hell is he thinking? It's almost always the president has a bad choice and a worse choice. And when he takes the bad choice, people who understand what's actually on the table as options realize, yeah, this is terrible. This sucks, but it sucks less than the other options on the table. So that's what we're going to do. So I think the thing to do at this point would be to basically say, not acknowledge it, not to say, hey, okay, you're right. You killed a bunch of our guys. We made a statement. They didn't kill anybody. The mullahs want to announce this to their people. Great. They can maintain their illusion of power for a little while longer. But the 2 things that need to be said are, in response to both points of your question, we'll deal with the second one first. The Iranian protesters and the people who despise the government that's been foisted on them since 1979 and has criminalized things like holding hands in public and listening to music and being gay, all of those other right-wing conservative causes that the Iranians hate us for so much. The people who are on the underground know what the score is. And whether they don't believe the Iranian government in anything they say, and they know that because they've seen their own people killed in the streets and been told that nothing happened. So I don't think it's going to affect the Iranian people and make them think, gee, our mullahs are really strong, because I don't think any of the Iranians really believe that they scored. When I say Iranians, I mean the Iranian resistance. And when I say the Iranian resistance, I don't know what percentage of the Iranian population it is, but it is certainly a larger percent of the population than the percent that genuinely in their hearts believe in this regime. And as you pointed out on our right angles, if you don't go to the funeral for this guy in Iran, no matter how much you may hate the mullahs. If you don't go, your life is in danger. So when
you're
you
saying,
see big crowds.
In essence, the only people being fooled in this are the mullahs, and they're not fooled as to whether or not there were casualties. They're fooled in that the people might possibly be fooled by them. So
they are in the hope that this will provide enough cover for them to maintain enough face to keep this regime in place. Let me just deal with the other thing you said, because I think it's much more important. And that was the first part of the question was, doesn't this just maintain the status quo? It most certainly does not maintain the status quo. Up until Donald Trump's presidency, and specifically up until this event, the status quo has been Iran threatens to build nuclear weapons, and the United States sends them money. And then Iran cheats on their promises not to work on the nuclear program, but continue to. And the United States places an embargo. And then the Iranians say, well, if you lift the embargo, then we'll stop working on our weapons. So we lift the embargo, and they continue to work on the weapons. And finally, when you get to Barack Obama, you basically say, look, how about if we give you $800 million in cash, Benjamins on a cargo pallet? Would that make you stop working on the program? And the Iranians go, yeah, absolutely. Yeah. They take the cash, they keep working on their weapons programs, they spend the cash on more terrorism. So up until 3 days ago, as we record this, it hasn't cost the Iranians anything. It hasn't cost them anything.
Well, other than about $1 billion a month that they're spending on supporting terrorism and neglecting their own people, and that continues to foster dissent internally.
But they don't care about their own people. That's clear. That's obviously clear. That's like saying the Chinese didn't care about their own people, or the Soviets.
But even Hitler cared about public opinion. I mean, they had to maintain a certain balance. You couldn't have your people all
starving to death. Hitler didn't care about public opinion. No, he did not, Scott. Hitler did not care about public opinion. There was no such thing as public opinion. Hitler didn't have to deal with polls, and Hitler didn't have to worry about whether or not people were on his side, because he had the Gestapo to terrorize people into absolute cowardice and fear, which is what almost any human being would do in those circumstances. They're not worried about public opinion. They're worried about maintaining a sense of terror and control. So yes,
but even to do that, you've got to have some living people to terrorize. So you need to maintain a certain economic standard among the broad populace in order to continue to hold control over them.
No, you don't.
Or at least you need to do that among the people who are carrying the weapons.
No. Hang on. No, you don't. Again, we're thinking like fairly rational Western people who are used to reasonable sets of trust and exchange and so on.
It's the burden I bear.
It is a dominance-based society. It is not a trust-based society. Most societies in the world, in fact, all of them prior to 400 years ago, were these kind of hierarchical, dominant. The king has his dukes who have their earls, who have their knights and so on. So it doesn't matter. The quality of life of the Iranian people doesn't matter to the mullahs, because as the leaders of a regime, they're not hurt by this. And a good way to think of this is to think of it with the Soviets. When you do something to when the Soviets were undergoing hardship as a result of their flawed philosophy, when they killed all of the railroad engineers, by the way, and I don't mean just engineers on the train, I mean the people that built the railroads, when the Soviets killed all of them, because they were bourgeois elements. And that led to the fact that on one particular line in the Soviet Union, in 1 year, on one line of tracks, there were 60,000 accidents in 1 year. So now you say to yourself, well, these accidents, my God, the Russian people surely must realize that this is a result of their own incompetent regime. But that's not how it was portrayed. It was portrayed as these accidents are acts of sabotage committed against us because we're succeeding. And the more that we succeed, the more the West is going to try and sabotage what we do. They called it wrecking. And so the idea that the truth will come out is not necessarily how they do their calculations. Same thing for the Chinese. They still think that they control the information and that means they can control the people. But the world is different now. The internet has allowed the signal to get out. And the signal, as we learned during the Cold War, the signal doesn't have to be broadcast. Let me rephrase this. In the Cold War, when you're dealing with an authoritarian, totalitarian, fear-based regime like the Soviet Union, the Soviet citizens did not have to have, every single one of them did not have to have a radio that was listening to Radio Free Europe or Voice of America. That's an unrealistic expectation, and most people don't have that kind of courage, and it's not unreasonable. What mattered was, did 1 in 100 people, or 1 in 1,000 people, or 1 in 10,000 people, did 1 in 1,000 people have a secret radio that could listen to Radio Free Europe? Because if they did, then those people would disseminate the message underground. And in the case of the Soviet Union, they called these samizdatsy. These were like basically hand-printed
little
leaflets.
Bulletins, yeah.
Yeah.
Let's take a final question here, because we're running kind of long and we're up against the break at the top of the hour. Let's say Iran is being truthful, the government of Iran, and saying that's enough. We feel like the retribution that we've exacted is adequate to compensate for the loss of Soleimani. But we know that Iran has a network of proxies throughout the Middle East, militias and other organizations that are committed to terrorism that have received backing from Iran for many, many years. How should the Trump administration view an attack by a rogue proxy, or for that matter, we don't know if it's a rogue proxy. Iran may be stepping back and saying, we're not going to do anything else. Meanwhile, go, Hezbollah, go. How does President Trump view future attacks in the coming days and weeks from Iran's proxies? Should he hold them as accountable as if they had done it with their own forces?
Well, absolutely. The entire look, if you look at the conventional forces of the United States versus Iran, you can't even put them on the same chart. There's just the scales don't match. I mean, so it's not 100 to 1 or 1,000 to 1. It's a 10,000 to 1 imbalance in our favor. So you have to ask yourself, why are we even having this conversation with this country that has got a couple of skips, for a navy? Why are we even having this conversation? We're having this conversation because Iran's strategy has been to be a nation state that has plausible deniability and commits most of its foreign policy through terror provided by Hezbollah or whatever the case may be, Quds as in the case of Soleimani. And so what you end up with is in the case of Iran, where you've got a nation state with a uniformed army and air force and navy, but most of their actual political influence is done by terrorist organizations because they want the plausible deniability of saying, hey, that wasn't the Iranians. Well, whatever these terrorists do is none of our business, even though, but I mean, the perfect example is the Iraq War. Most every American that we lost in that conflict, we lost due to improvised explosive devices, IEDs. And virtually every single one of those IEDs was designed and built and in many cases installed by Iranians. But they had the plausible deniability, and President Bush and Obama and pretty much going back to 1979, the presidents of the United States have agreed to this ridiculous premise. They've agreed to it. So if somebody blows up an IED in 2006 and kills 10 Americans, and we know that it's an Iranian IED, we pretend like it's not. The thing about Donald Trump, and people talk about how he's unsophisticated and he lacks a strategic vision, and I don't personally think that's accurate, but let's just say it is. What Donald Trump understands and what he has the moral courage to do is to say that we are no longer going to pretend to play this game by your rules. We're no longer going to pretend that Iranian terrorism is not a product of the Iranian nation state. And so if there's this Iranian general who is leading a terror attack or is about to lead a terror attack against American servicemen or American civilians, and who has the blood of hundreds, if not thousands of American soldiers on his hands already, this president has the moral clarity to say the only reason we're having this discussion is because we're willing to abide by these ridiculous, insane rules. We know that Iran is backing these terror organizations. Iran knows they're backing these terror organizations, and Iran knows that we know that they're backing these terror organizations. So it's worked for them. All of a sudden, the top guy in this chain of deception and mutual kind of insanity is taken out of the game by a president that realizes that, okay, no, the guy was not in a tank. He was not in a tank crossing the border, guns firing, so we hit him with the Hellfire missile. This president realized that this Iranian general was, in fact, causing events in place that have already happened and that were about to happen that were going to cost American lives. And he decided to burn through this illusion and simply say, look, we know who he is. You know who he is. We're going to kill him. And we're going to, and it's not an assassination. I think that term is inappropriate. You can use it in the sense that it went after one individual person. It's probably fair in that sense. But to say it's an assassination makes it sound like a political statement. It's not a political statement. It's a military statement. This was a military general who was killed in Iraq working on terrorist activities in Iraq to kill Americans. And if this is the strategy that Iran wants to deploy, this sense of, well, we didn't do it because they didn't have Iranian uniforms on, so it wasn't us. If this is the strategy that they've used since 1979, it's about time that an American president said, we're not playing by these rules anymore. You know, we both know, the world knows. And so now we're going to take action against your strategy that's been so successful for you. And I hope, I don't know, but I hope that this kind of thing now is a chastened and somewhat shocked Iranian government saying, well, fortunately we killed hundreds of Americans in our counterattack, so they paid for their assassination and now we'll call it square. That to me sounds like a regime that is doing a great many recalculations about things that are long overdue.
Bill Whittle Now is a production of the members at BillWhittle.com. You can join them today by clicking that Become a Member link at BillWhittle.com. We also receive assistance from our friends over at Patreon.com/BillWhittle, as well as our buddies at the Patriot Post, America's News Digest. We'll provide links to all that in the description below, as well as a link to our upcoming cruise, May 15th through the 18th on the Navigator of the Seas, a Royal Caribbean ship of the line, so to speak, where we're going to need a bigger boat. 3 nights out in the Caribbean and headed toward the Bahamas and having fellowship with the people who are members and fans of this show, as well as your dear host right here. If you'd like to be part of any or all of that, just click the links in the descriptions below. For Bill Whittle, I'm Scott Ott. Thanks for watching.